Hey guys, tonight we're boarding a creaky 18th century sailing ship drifting somewhere in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but slapping waves and the distant cry of a gull that may or may not be laughing at you. The air stinks of salt, sweat, and fish guts. Your boots squelch against soaked planks. You squint up at a sail flapping like laundry in a hurricane and wonder, how the hell are we telling time again? You glance at the small wooden box hanging by the helm. Inside, not a watch, not a compass, not a celestial sextant kissed by Newton's genius. No, it's cheese. Welcome to timekeeping, sailor. You're part of a centuries-old seafaring tradition that desperately wants to be scientific. But let's be honest, most of the time it's just slightly moldy guesswork with a strong odor. Historians still argue whether this cheese-based method was taken seriously or was just a weird footnote in naval experimentation. But tonight, you're going to pretend it works, because otherwise you're just adrift in chaos. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. So I'd love to know who's falling asleep to the slow rise of cheese history now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The deck groans as you trudge across it, wiping sweat from your brow with a sleeve that smells like last week's fish stew. The sun is a white blur above, its placement mostly irrelevant since nobody here trusts it to tell the time. Everyone knows it shifts too much, especially when you're down near the equator. And besides, cloudy days make it vanish entirely. What you do, trust at least marginally, is something kept below deck, wrapped in a wax cloth, in a drawer that only one crew member is allowed to open. The ship's cheese. It's not for eating. That's a different cheese, if you're lucky. This one is dry, dense, and old-aged for consistency, not taste. Think of it like a dairy-based sundial that never saw the sun. It's shaped like a wheel, about the size of a captain's palm, and marked by tiny scratches along its edge, each made by a ship's logbook keeper who thinks he's being clever. According to this system developed by a few enterprising Dutch traders who apparently thought cheese could be both lunch and laboratory, rotate it 1 tick per hour, sniff for ammonia, and note any textural shifts. You'd think someone was joking, but no, it's all taken quite seriously by the older crew, who treat the cheese like a relic. One even claims he saw it sweat just before a storm. That man is missing 3 toes and wears a necklace made of crab claws. Still, you believe him. The concept, if you stretch your imagination, like the ship's rigging, is simple. The cheese dehydrates slightly every hour, in predictable patterns. Or so the logic goes. Much like using rings on a tree stump to guess its age, sailors tried tracking environmental changes by observing how the cheese aged. If you handled it too much, the warmth of your hand could throw it off. If it molded, you were late. If it cracked, you were really late. Even the Royal Navy, in its most desperate periods, reportedly looked into alternative timekeeping tools after yet another expensive voyage crashed into an island because someone's sandglass emptied too early. Fringe records hint that in 1742, a captain named Giles Morecambe insisted that he could measure half-quarter bells more accurately by slicing into a gouda. He was not promoted. Now you, junior sailor with 0 clout and a stomach full of dried peas and regret, are being told to tend the cheese. Not the sails, not the helm, the cheese. So down below deck you go, lantern flickering. The hold smells like rope, rats, and whatever died behind the barley sack last week. You kneel, open the drawer, and there it is. Your wheel of time. It's waxy, cracked slightly on the edge. A trace of green fuzz at 11 o'clock. Wait, that might have been there yesterday. You rotate it 1 notch clockwise. The wax resists, slightly. You log the time. Somewhere above, the bell rings. It's your shift. somewhere in the bureaucratic records, back in London. A man is writing a letter demanding better marine chronometers. You won't hear about it until 3 years from now, when you dock in Portsmouth and get paid in half-frosted coinage and a piece of dried beef that could break a jaw. But until then, the cheese is your anchor in time. You pass it off to the next. Watch like a holy relic. He sneers at you, mutters something about rookies and smelling wrong, and pokes the rind with a knife. The oddest part, it kind of works, at least better than guessing. Or maybe you're just convincing yourself. It does, because otherwise you'd spiral into existential dread about being a speck of salted humanity in a vast uncaring sea. Either way, the cheese gives you something solid to trust even if it's fermented. Historians still debate whether the so-called cheese clocks were widespread or just occasional oddities found on merchant vessels run by creatively desperate captains. There are scattered shiplogs that hint at time cheese, or rot bell, or old wheel, often accompanied by question marks or doodles. One French log simply notes, "Le fromage est Dieu," the cheese is God. Draw your own conclusions. Meanwhile, you return above deck. The breeze is stiff, and the stars are just starting to wink through the twilight. Your next meal is likely to contain weevils. But for now, you glance toward the helm, nod to the quartermaster, and think, yes, I have marked the passage of time, using a slightly rancid wheel of dairy, and tomorrow, you'll do it again. You eat maggots, but keep the brie. You're hunched over a wooden bowl, poking at something that was allegedly salted pork, but now more closely resembles a warm eraser. Around you, other sailors gnaw mindlessly at their own trenchers' hardened biscuits that double as weapons in a brawl and pillows in a storm. You chew, you regret, you swallow. The pork bites back. No one talks about the maggots anymore. They're a feature, not a bug. Protein, someone said once, and everyone nodded like that made it fine. But even in this culinary horror show, there's one thing you never eat: the cheese. Not the little hunks rationed with hardtack. Know that cheese is fair game and tastes like salty foot. But the sacred wheel tucked inside the captain's cabinet, untouchable, revered, sniffed gently like perfume, handled with ceremonial reverence, like some religious artifact or the last bar of soap on the ship. You may be starving. You may be down to your last toe fungus-free sock. But if you so much as look hungry around the time cheese, you'll get assigned to bilge duty until your soul leaves your body. Why? Because this cheese, this slightly sweating, occasionally fuzzy wedge of hope, has been on board longer than you. It came aboard wrapped in linen, sealed in beeswax, and was introduced to the crew with more ceremony than your own arrival. There was a toast. Rum was involved. One sailor cried. It all began, allegedly, with a Dutch fleet trying to cut costs. Timepieces were expensive and fragile, breaking at sea faster than a drunk helmsman's promises. But cheese aged. Cheese reacted to moisture and temperature. Cheese was already on board. So some bored quartermaster, possibly mid-delirium from scurvy, decided to chart its decay as a potential time marker. Was it science? Was it desperation? Historians still argue whether this was an earnest naval experiment or the maritime equivalent of playing chess with turnips. But your ship's log mentions the tradition going back at least 6 captains, and that's good enough for you. Your ship's time cheese sits in a custom wooden cradle, carved with sunburst patterns and latitude markers. A little dramatic, you think, until you remember that your compass spins freely when you approach Bermuda and no one wants to talk about it. This cheese may be the only thing keeping you grounded literally and figuratively. Now, the funny thing about keeping cheese aboard a ship isn't that it's smelly. Everything is smelly. You're smelly. The sails are smelly. The ocean has its own wet, briny odor that clings to your hair. No, the weird thing is that sailors start reading the cheese. You overheard the first mate say the mold growth was tracking eastward, like it had opinions on direction. Another guy claimed the cheese tightened right before his cousin fell overboard. He thinks it was trying to warn him. You begin to think that cheese, like rats and ghosts, has a private language at sea. Meanwhile, meals continue as they always have, violently bland and questionably textured. Your only seasoning is what drips from the ceiling, and your only comfort is the 2 hard candies you're saving for the equator crossing. You've tried to swap them for better boots. No dice. But again, no one eats the thyme cheese. Even when supplies run low. Even when the cook starts boiling boots for broth, the thyme cheese stays untouched. Why? Because to tamper with it would be to dismantle the only system on board pretending to impose structure. Timekeeping aboard ships is chaotic. Hourglasses are inconsistent. Bells are only as accurate as the guy ringing them. The sun's too shifty. But the cheese just is. It changes slowly, predictably, absorbing the ship's every mood. Or so it seems. The cook, of course, wants to eat it. He's lobbied repeatedly to have it grated into the gruel, just for morale. But the captain vetoes him with a glare and a hand over his heart. She tells us things, he says. She's seen the Americas. You try not to roll your eyes. You've heard that on Spanish ships they used orange peels and string knots for timekeeping. In China, sailors favored water clocks sealed inside brass kettles. But no one has matched the bizarre endurance of Dutch and British obsession with moldy dairy. One French privateer captured a merchant vessel and reportedly threw the cheese overboard, declaring it cursed. The ship ran aground 3 days later. Coincidence? Probably. But you wouldn't risk it. Your ship has a cheese whisperer. That's not his title, of course. Officially, he's the 3rd mate. But he's the only one allowed to interact with the cheese regularly. He logs its texture 3 times daily, smooth, firm, glistening, and the ominous tense. Once, he described it as philosophical, and nobody laughed. He claims to dream about it sometimes. You believe him. One night, when the moon is low and the crew is passing around a bottle of something that smells like paint thinner and poor decisions, someone suggests cutting the cheese to see what's inside. You all stare at him like he's just suggested eating the ship's cat. No, the whisperer says, in a voice barely above the wind. We don't cut time. You don't cut time. You nod, silently, reverently, and never bring it up again, of course. The actual science of cheese decay at sea is laughable. The constant shifts in humidity, temperature, and salt exposure make it wildly inconsistent. Number 2 voyages yield the same mold patterns. Historians still argue whether any data gathered was remotely useful. Some say the tradition was symbolic, a psychological crutch for men adrift, grasping for anything familiar. Others suggest it was part of a broader seafaring culture that worshipped routine. No matter how ridiculous. You, personally, think it's like wearing lucky socks. They don't do anything, but you really don't want to find out what happens if you stop. So tonight, you fall asleep beside a box of cheese, dreaming of bells and stars and crumbly rinds, and for a moment, the sea feels less endless, you sailing, blind under the starless fog. It's your turn on the night watch, and there's no moon tonight, no stars either, just an endless gray fog that has swallowed the sky, the horizon, and most of your sanity. You're steering the ship into nothingness, guided only by the soft creak of the rigging and the constant slap of waves on the hull. Your breath hangs in the air like a whispered prayer, and the cheese is watching. Well, not literally. It doesn't have eyes. Probably. Still, somewhere below deck, wrapped in wax cloth, nestled in its cradle like a baby Jesus carved from dairy, the cheese is quietly, aging, maturing, in the way that only cheese and anxious sailors can. But, here's the thing, when the sky disappears, and the sun can't tell you where you are, what time it is, or if you're sailing straight into a reef, you start to realize just how painfully dependent you are on clocks, and you don't have one. Marine Chronometers, those finely tuned timepieces that could keep accurate time even at CRNT on your ship. They're too expensive, too fragile, too rare. Only the Navy's fanciest vessels or government-sponsored expeditions get them. You've got a sandglass and a wheel of Gouda that smells like feet. Right now, that sandglass is your official timekeeper, and it's doing a terrible job. Every hour, or what you think is an hour, someone flips it, but the grains get sticky in damp weather, or blow away in the wind if the glass gets cracked, or worst, just vanish entirely when a bored sailor uses them to scrub barnacles off his boots. Historians still argue whether sandglasses were reliable enough to be trusted in life or death navigation. One camp believes they were passable if maintained meticulously, flipped on time, and kept dry. The other camp, likely composed of people who have actually been at sea, calls that a hilarious fantasy. You try not to think about it. Tonight, all you have are your instincts and that faint rhythm you've been taught to trust. 8 bells in 4 hours, with someone turning the hourglass each time. But if that person misses a turn or flips it too early, you're off by minutes, maybe more. And on the ocean, a few minutes could be dozens of nautical miles off course. That's where the cheese comes in. You duck below deck quickly, claiming you need to relieve yourself, which is code for, I need to check the cheese, or I'll lose my mind. The captain doesn't ask questions. He's done it too. You light your lantern, the tiny flame flickering in protest. The hold smells of rope, damp wood, and that indescribable ship musk of mildew and old dreams. And there it is, your stinky oracle. You open the box, lift the wax cloth, and stare. Same crust, same faint green rind, a slight bulge near the center. Normal, probably. You give it a slow, reverent sniff. It smells sharp tonight, tangy, pungent in that weird, familiar way. You squint. The crack from 2 days ago seems deeper, but that might just be your nerves talking. You rotate it 1 tick. The wood under it creaks. You log the time. And there it is, again that moment of peace, the illusion of structure, of knowing. You may be sailing blind into fog that could go on for days, but you've just turned the cheese. You've marked time. You remember what the whisperer said, when the stars vanish, the rind remembers. You head back up top, eyes blurry from the lamplight, and rejoin the crew. The wind picks up slightly, and your hand brushes the rigging. Damp, slick, cold. You can't see the stars tonight, but the helmsman's humming an old Dutch tune under his breath. That same one, they say, was played during a voyage that crossed the Atlantic in 46 days, with nothing but a cheese, 2 spoons, and dumb luck. The fog thickens. You can barely see the bow of the ship now. Every wave feels heavier. You grip the rail and peer out into the gloom, hoping for a glimpse of land, a flicker of lighthouse, something. Nothing, just gray and wet. You think back to stories of sailors who tried navigating by the stars and were thrown hundreds of miles off course by cloudy weather. They'd wind up in the wrong hemisphere, stumbling into enemy waters or iceberg fields, all because the heavens refused to cooperate. One famously doomed expedition tried to feel the equator by sniffing the air. They did not make it home. This is why some captains, eccentric, desperate, maybe brilliant, resorted to weird, almost ritualistic backups. A few logs reference citrus clocks, mold calendars, and cheese compasses. These were rarely official, but they existed. Hidden systems in the lower decks. Bits of soft order in the sea's chaos. Historians still argue whether these practices were folk, superstition, or primitive science. One professor even suggested that the consistency of a cheese wheel under stable storage conditions could function as a passive ambient thermometer, which sounds clever until you remember your stable storage is a rolling wooden box in the middle of an ocean thunderstorm. The bells ring faintly in the mist 4 half-hour marks. You glance up. Someone mutters, "That's for bells." Aye. And another replies, "Only if the glass was flipped on time." And that's the terrifying truth. No one really knows. You could be 2 bells late, or 1 early. The fog has swallowed the sky, the ocean has swallowed your sense of direction. And the cheese, your only reliable constant, might be slowly swelling in sympathy. You grip the helm, watch the faint ripple of dark water ahead, and hope that somewhere, deep inside, that stubborn little wheel of dairy, the truth of time still clings. After all, you're a sailor now, and on a ship with no stars and no clock. You take your truth where you can find it. Sandglasses, sea rot, and your cursed shift. You don't mind the sea so much, except for the parts that try to kill you, which is roughly 85% of it. Right now, you're halfway through the worst shift of the voyage. Pre-dawn. Watch that slow, sickening window between too late to sleep and too early for coffee, where time loses all shape. The ship is eerily quiet, except for the soft gurgle of water curling along the hull and the occasional groan from the mast. Like it's dreaming of retirement. You clutch the sandglass in your hand, not because it's accurate, it isn't. You just need something to stare at. Its wooden frame is stained and splintery, and the glass bulbs are fogged from countless salty hands and damp mornings. The grains inside fall in their usual indifferent cascade, completely unaware that your ship's navigation depends on them being precisely accurate to the second. Spoiler, they are not. You flip the glass with a dull thunk. The shift begins. They told you the sandglass was 30 minutes. 2 flips, 1 bell. The bosun grunted at you on your first day. But this one feels twitchy. It runs faster in colder air, slower when someone breathes near it. And once, when left near the galley fire, it accelerated so dramatically, it sparked a half-day delay no one wanted to admit to. This is why the cheese is sacred. Down below, wrapped in wax cloth and weird hopes, the time cheese sits in silence. Its firm yet yielding texture seems, somehow, more trustworthy than the 800 grains of slippery sand trickling through a crooked hourglass. You start to imagine it whispering to itself in mold language, keeping track of the day while the rest of the ship slowly forgets what time even means. Historians still argue whether sailors ever genuinely believed these backup systems worked. Some suggest it was pure ritual, a way to force a rhythm into lives that otherwise blurred into wet, sleepless days. Others insist there's anecdotal evidence of dairy-based timekeeping working almost as well as early marine chronometers. Then, again, anecdotal evidence is also how we got sea monsters and mermaid marriages. You lean against the rail, watching the horizon not appear. Fog, always fog. It's like sailing through wet wool. You think about the old ship tales, ghost vessels lost in fog, sailing in circles for centuries. Their clocks stopped, their cheese still soft. You can't help but glance toward the hold. Just last week, a visiting Dutch trader laughed when he saw your cheese wheel, said it looked dry and tired. Then he pulled out his ship's time wheel rounder, creamier, clearly younger. Yours looked like a veteran. His looked like a debutante. He said his was double waxed for enhanced reliability. You haven't stopped thinking about it since. Back to your cursed shift. The ship's deck is covered in salt film. Your boots leave faint prints with each step, and your fingers are so calloused you could probably grate the cheese with them. You check the sandglass again. Still falling, or maybe not. It's hard to tell. You squint. You swear the grains are clumping. You gently tap the glass. It does nothing. Then it speeds up. Then it slows again. You miss clocks. Real clocks. Pendulums. Hands that tick. Numbers. Those don't work out here, too bouncy. Too fragile. You heard about one rich explorer who brought a grand clock on board, wrapped in silk, suspended in a padded box, and surrounded by oranges to cushion the blows. It shattered in a mild breeze and had to be thrown overboard before the crew mutinied. So now it's sand and cheese. That's what you've got. And you're not alone. Your shiftmate, a barrel-chested fellow named Gervin, has been watching the cheese's progress like it's a beloved pet. She's stiff this week, he whispers, like it's the weather forecast. Could be a storm. You want to ask him what he's comparing it to, but he's already walking away. Nodding sagely. One time, the cheese was too soft, and the ship missed a scheduled course correction by 6 hours. They blamed the cheese, not the sailor. The logic was circular. So's the cheese. You didn't ask questions. The bell rings twice. Half your shift is over. You flip the sandglass again and pray it behaves. A rat scurries past your boot. You don't flinch anymore. You remember the training. Mark the bells. Trust the logs. Don't question the cheese. It's the logs that bother you most. Captain keeps a separate one for the cheese tiny entries in spidery ink. Rind holding, faint, ammonia small split on starboard face. You once saw blistering near midnight, and now you can't unsee that image in your mind. Every time the fog thickens, someone checks the cheese dot. Every time the sun disappears for days, someone checks the cheese dot. Every time the sandglass clumser, the bell ringer drinks too much grog and forgets his duty. The cheese becomes the tiebreaker. There's a logic to it. Sort of. The ship itself is made of wood that expands and contracts. The ropes stretch. The sails tear. The only thing that behaves with any consistency, oddly enough, is the cheese. Maybe it's because the wax coating regulates its exposure. Maybe it's because it responds to temperature and humidity with stubborn resilience. Or maybe it's just a lucky charm that happens to be edible. You finish your shift. Below deck, the third mate is inspecting the cheese with a silver spoon. He tilts his head. She's peeking, he says cryptically. Then, to no one in particular, turn her 10 degrees. You don't even ask what that means. Instead, you crawl into your hammock, the ship creaking around you, the scent of mold and salt and wet canvas filling your nose. You close your eyes. You dream of hourglasses that flow backwards. You dream of a sea made of brie. You dream of a bell that never rings. And somewhere in the dark, the cheese keeps time. Longitude lost. And so are you. It's official. You're lost. Not dramatically. Lost. Like the kind of lost where sea monsters circle your hull, and the captain tears his shirt open and screams at the stars. No, this is the quiet kind of lost, the creeping, slow burn kind. The we passed that same cloud 3 times kind. The didn't we already see that island? Kind. And worst of all, the kind of lost where everyone pretends they aren't. That's the deadliest lost of all. You're adrift in the uncharted somewhere. A place the map claims is just blue. There are no stars out tonight, no land in sight. And your chronometer? Oh wait, right, you don't have one. You've got an inaccurate sandglass, a hungover bell ringer, and a wheel of cheese that may or may not be trying to tell you something with its latest rind wrinkle. Here's where things get spicy. Longitude, you see. For centuries, people could figure out latitude, the north-south direction, fairly easily. Measure the height of the sun at noon, get a decent sextant reading, and boom, you're roughly somewhere between Arctic panic and equator sunburn. But longitude, that east-west positioning, that was the stuff of nightmares to measure. Longitude, you needed to know the exact time back at a fixed point, like Greenwich, England, while also knowing the local time where you were. The difference between those two would tell you how far east or west you'd sailed. Easy enough in theory, but try doing that when the only reliable clock you have is Gouda. Historians still argue whether any ship actually successfully used a cheese wheel to calculate anything resembling longitude. One account from a Danish merchant ship in 1731 claimed their time wheel grew a precise streak of bluish mold every 12 hours. They measured longitude by how fast the stripe crawled. Another theory is that nobody genuinely believed in cheese navigation, it was just a morale tool for nervous crews. Either way, you're here now, squinting at a map, wondering whether that tiny smear of ink labeled possibly Madeira is where you're heading or where you should have been 2 days ago. Captain's not panicking yet, but his eyebrow twitches every time someone mentions the word current, and the quartermaster has started chewing his pipe stem a bit more aggressively. You're instructed to recheck the reference, which is your ship's fancy way of saying, go poke the cheese and see what it thinks. Down into the hold you go again. Lantern in hand, boots thudding on the steps. The air is damp and thick, like breathing through a wet sock. You pass barrels of salted meat, some of which look like they've developed ambitions. The cheese sits in its usual wax-wrapped cradle, unbothered by your crisis. You open it. A whiff of ammonia tickles your nose. Sharp, assertive, noted. There's a subtle discoloration around the outer rind, pale yellow leaning into greenish gray. You rotate it carefully, mark the ring, compare it to the reference scratch etched into the wood, half a notch off. Your gut drops. That could mean 5 minutes. It could mean 30. It could mean absolutely nothing still. You log it. You report back to the deck, scribbled note in hand. The cheese has shifted. Or maybe the ship has. Either way, a course correction is issued. 15 degrees east. Nobody says it aloud, but you all know it. This could be wrong. Horribly wrong. But without a proper chronometer, you're navigating by texture and odor, and that's just how it is. You remember reading once, well, hearing technically. Someone read it aloud over grug that in 1707, a British fleet led by Admiral Shovel crashed into the Isles of Scilly, killing over 1,400 men. Why? They got their longitude wrong, misjudged their position by miles. No cheese aboard that time, just bad math and worse maps. It was disasters like that which pushed governments to finally fund serious timekeeping inventions. In 1714, the British Parliament offered the longitude prize Vinci Libres Minusa, massive fortune at the time, to anyone who could solve the longitude problem. Clocks were the preferred answer, of course, but it took decades to perfect a marine chronometer that could survive a ship's endless rocking and damp despair. Until then, desperate captains did desperate things, including asking a cheese what time it was. A French journal from the era jokes about le fromage de mer, the sea cheeses, a kind of mystical object, half mascot, half metronome. One particularly flamboyant admiral claimed his aged comte gained telepathic awareness of Greenwich time after 5 months at sea. He was quietly retired. Still, that kernel of desperation remains with you. You're drifting blind. No reliable reference. No celestial help. You turn to what you have. Cheese, sand, salt, gut instinct, and the whispers of older sailors. You feel it in your knees. One mutters. When the tide pulls wrong, the ship lists left, and the cheese curls. ... That's how you know you've drifted. You nod like you understand. You don't. By evening, the sky begins to clear. A few stars peek through. The navigator rushes to the deck with a sextant, desperate to verify your location the real way. He scribbles furiously, confers with the captain. They go pale. You're off by 50 miles. 50 miles. No one says anything about the cheese. They never do when it's wrong. Instead, the course is adjusted. The bells are rerung. The sandglass is reset. But the cheese remains in its cradle, unblamed, untouched, like a god that's fallen, slightly out of favor but no one dares insult. You settle back into your hammock, the creak of the ship matching the creak of your ribs. The stars are overhead now, the wind's picked up, and you're finally, maybe, back on course. But as you drift off to sleep, you swear you hear something shift softly below deck, just a waxy moldrummed crack like the cheese disapproving. From afar, Newton's smug guess, v. salty reality. You're wiping crusted salt from your eyes when the captain starts muttering again about theoretical nonsense. It's not the usual kind of muttering about barnacles, or incompetent bell ringers, or what happened in Port Royal that one time no one talks about. No, this time it's personal. He's ranting about Isaac Newton. Now, you've never met Isaac Newton. Odds are, you never will. But he has a face. A powdered, princely, slightly pouty face on a pamphlet someone once waved around at the Royal Dockyards. He's the reason your ship is chasing a horizon it may never reach, and why your fellow sailors both curse and admire a man who spent most of his life indoors, inventing calculus while trying to turn mercury into gold. Newton had a solution to the longitude problem. Well, a suggestion, really. The sea, he claimed, could be tamed through the power of astronomy. Observe the moons of Jupiter, he said. Chart the celestial clock. Use lunas. Use math. Sure, Isaac, let me just whip out a telescope the size of a cannon and measure the moons of a planet 390 million miles away, while standing on a ship that rocks harder than a tavern brawl on payday. Your captain clearly remembers trying. He squints at the sky and mutters lunar's paw. You know he once cracked his own sextant in half, in a fit of navigational rage. The ship's dog still won't go near it. Historians still argue whether Newton's ideas were visionary or totally impractical for life at sea. Mathematically, brilliant. Practically, try charting angular distances while your ship tips 30 degrees and a seagull poops in your eyepiece. This is why your ship hand many like it turned not to astronomy, but to cheese. You trudge below deck again to check on the blessed brie. You don't want to, but your name's on the duty roster in smeared charcoal. Third mate says it's a moldy one tonight, and hands you the lantern with all the enthusiasm of a man passing a cursed relic. You open the box. The cheese is contemplative. It's dry around the edges, softer in the center. A faint rind wrinkle forms a crescent, like a sleepy grin. The smell is stronger than usual sharp, with a back note of wood smoke and despair. You give it the usual 90-degree rotation. Note the resistance, and right, tacky, weighted, settling. You make your way topside again, fighting back the thought that Newton would laugh at you if he could see this. Cheese clocks, the height of empirical observation. But you're not alone. Back then, the Royal Society and other high-minded organizations were in an all-out war of ideas. Should longitude be solved by machines, by astronomy, or by something totally bonkers like dropping regular explosions in the water and measuring the echoes? Yes, that was a real idea. Amid all this intellectual chaos, Cheese seemed humble, approachable, already on board. Sure, it didn't give you an exact time down to the second, but it behaved. It reacted to heat and moisture. It changed predictably on long voyages, at least in theory, and most importantly, it didn't shatter when a cannon fired or someone tripped over a chicken dot. Plus, there was always one guy who swore by it. Every ship had one. On yours, it's Gervin, as always, who watches the cheese like it holds the secrets of the universe. He once claimed it shivered before a squall. You're still not sure if that was metaphor or mold-related. Today, though, the cheese has become a point of quiet contention. The navigator recently returned from a dry land training course, wants to ditch it. He's been reading Newton's works, carrying around a pamphlet titled The Motions of the Heavens for Practical Mariners, with diagrams of planets, moons, and charts so dense you get a headache just looking at them. We should be using lunars, he says. Proper math. We should be using what doesn't sink, replies Gervin. You just stay quiet. You've seen what happens when the cheese gets involved in a disagreement. Last time it was during a storm. The navigator tried to lock it up in the storeroom. The next day, the rudder cracked. Coincidence? Sure, but no one's tried it again. There's also the matter of the ticking box. You've heard whispers of it, some ship down south, funded by the Board of Longitude, carrying a top-secret prototype of a marine clock, built by a man named John Harrison. They say it kept perfect time from England to the West Indies. Didn't drift a second. Number? Mold required. The captain's heard the same rumors. His mood darkens every time the name comes up. If clocks are so great, he grumbles, why are half of M sunk with the ships? You don't argue, because for now, the cheese remains the safest bet aboard a vessel too poor, too stubborn, and too traditional to adopt the latest miracle. And strangely, it's reliable, or at least, consistently inconsistent. Like the sea itself. You learn to read the patterns, even if you don't fully understand them. A bulging edge. Maybe 3 days in tropical air. Fissure down the middle. Time for a course correction. Pungent temps that makes your eyes water. Possibly noon, or possibly bad luck. Either way, it's logged. Historians still argue whether such logging served any real navigational purpose or whether it just made sailors feel like they were contributing to a grander scientific experiment. You think back to Newton, staring into his telescope, chasing lunar orbits, imagining a ship full of brilliant astronomers. Instead, he got you. And cheese. The clouds part briefly. The sun creeps through. The first bell rings. Gervin turns to you and says, "Time to smell the truth." You nod. The cheese awaits. When mold knows more than men, you're below deck again, knees creaking like the hull, face lit by the weak glow of a battered lantern. And there it is, your old friend. The cheese. Only today, it looks ... different. You don't know how to explain it. The cheese hasn't moved. Of course not. It's not alive probably, but it seems somehow puffier, warmer maybe. There's a subtle new pattern on its edge like ripples in old paper. The mold has bloomed in a delicate spiral, soft green, fanning outward in fractal perfection. You stare. The lantern flickers. You swear the cheese breathes. You reach out, not touching, just observing. Your fingers hover above its waxy surface like a diviner with a crystal ball. It's ridiculous. It's cheese, but also it's not anymore. This wheel has seen storms, has held together the morale of an exhausted crew, and now it appears to be whispering something no one else can hear. Gervin says the spiral means a front's coming. North wind, he mutters, as if mold placement is more trustworthy than the sky, and maybe it is. Because up top, the clouds haven't broken, but the air has shifted. It smells metallic, damp, tense, like the ocean is bracing for something. The ship creaks. You adjust the cheese one notch and write spiral bloom, east, ammonia sharp, rising tension. The whisperer reads it over your shoulder and nods. Might be a squall. She always flinches before a squall. You asked, but he's already walking away. Historians still argue whether mold could ever be used as a viable barometric reading. Some point to fermentation studies that suggest microbial behavior shifts under pressure and humidity changes, meaning the cheese might, just might, be responding to the weather faster than human senses. Others argue that's nonsense. And sailors were just bored enough to find patterns in anything. Still, you can't deny the timing. The cheese changes, and then something happens. The sea lurches, the wind veers. The sails shudder like nervous lungs. Once, a sailor claimed he saw the mold recede just before a rogue wave hit. That sailor now wears a rabbit's foot and sleeps with his boots on. You tuck the cheese away gently, sealing it tight in its wax wrap. You've come to treat it like something between a pet and a priest. It smells bad. It judges silently, and sometimes you swear it answers prayers, just not in any language you understand. Back on deck. The ship is preparing for trouble, sails reefed, lines checked, men moving with the solemn energy of those who've survived rough water before and know better than to speak its name. The navigator mutters about barometers and celestial signs, but the rest of the crew glances below, toward the hold, like the real oracles already spoken. The sky cracks open at noon, not with rain yet, but with light. A blade of sunlight cuts through cloud cover, illuminating the sea in a golden streak. It hits the deck, sharp and clean, and in that moment, everything holds its breath. Even the sails pause. You're standing by the mast, squinting into the sudden brightness when the bell rings. 4.5 hours, 2 bells, but it's off. You feel it. The sandglass didn't drop right. Maybe it's stuck. Maybe the bell ringer miscounted. Either way, something's wrong. You volunteer. You're already moving before they ask. Back to the cheese. It's warmer now. Not hot cheese. Doesn't get hot unless something's very wrong, but definitely not cool. The spiral bloom has continued. You lift it, gently, turn it, check the texture. There's a slight give beneath the wax. You log it. Bloom doubling, center softness, clock rotation. You bring the log to the captain. He reads it like scripture. Double bloom, yeah. He doesn't smile. He just nods, then adjusts the heading by 6 degrees starboard. She says the current's changed. You don't even blink, because here's the thing. At this point, it's working better than the sandglass, and maybe even better than your second mate's attempts at estimating solar noon using a broken quadrant and a piece of string. There's a strange moment on every long voyage, when sailors stop caring whether something is scientific or not so long as it works. If a wheel of moldy dairy gives them a whisper of direction, they'll follow it. You remember what Gervin told you once: the cheese doesn't lie. It just changes slowly enough for us to pretend it's not smarter than we are. And maybe he's right. Maybe mold does know more than men. Maybe its quiet response to temperature, humidity, microbial presence, pressure, vibration, and sheer time spent existing makes it a better sailor than any of you. After all, the cheese doesn't panic. It doesn't argue. It doesn't sleep. It just waits and molds. One fringe theory found in a strange and soggy book left behind by a Polish naturalist who spent 5 years on Dutch trading ships claimed that aged cheese contains temporal memory, that by absorbing the shifting conditions of each voyage, the cheese learns that, given enough journeys, it can be consulted for future ones, like a biological logbook encoded in fungus. That book now rests in the captain's quarters, wedged between a moldy Bible and a bottle of Dutch rum. He hasn't ruled it out. You wake up the next morning to calmer seas. The wind has shifted. The heading held end down in the hold. The cheese looks exactly the same, which somehow feels like a miracle of bells, bumps, and brie predictions. You're woken early not by a bell, but by a bump. A strange one, not the usual lurch of the sea or the soft moan of a shifting hull. No, this is sharper, intentional, like something nudged the ship, politely but firmly, as if to say, "Hey, wake up. You might want to look outside." You scramble up to the deck, boots half-laced, shirt stuck to your back with sweat and regret. The air is thick with mist again, but it's warmer now, almost tropical. Birds circle high above, their screeches sounding like arguments you're not invited to. And out there, cutting through the fog-dash land, or something like it, a shape, jagged, not marked on any chart you've seen. You're definitely off course. The bells are ringing, of course, in their smug, regular way. One every half hour, punctuating your descent into navigational chaos. But everyone knows they're just guessing now. The sandglass, last night, someone dropped it during a storm roll, and the replacement is sticky with grease and confusion. The grains fall slower now, like they're tired. That's when the whisperer appears, holding the logbook and looking as solemn as a priest at a pirate's funeral. The cheese changed. You glance around. No one laughs. He leads you below. And again, there it is, center stage in its little box. Your stinky oracle. The first thing you notice is the crack. A fine fissure running across the wax surface, like a hairline fracture in a teacup. Not deep, but definite. You tap around it gently. The sound's off, hollow. It's split around midnight. The whisperer murmurs, Never seen her split it, night before. You both stare at it. The log is updated. Midnight fissure. Eastward bias. Shell tightening. That last note. Shell tightening. That's what the crew calls it when the wax gets firmer, tougher, like it's bracing for something. And it always means land, or impact. Historians still argue whether mold expansion patterns could ever serve as predictive tools for sailors. One side says it's impossible, decay isn't prophecy. The other counters that, in a closed system like a ship's hold, cheese responds so acutely to atmospheric change that it essentially senses upcoming events, pressure drops, land masses, disrupting airflow, nearby storms. One journal called it accidental augury. You call it better than bells. Up on deck, the captain orders the sails trimmed. A scout is posted at the bow. You're ordered to bring the cheese topside, something never done lightly. You cradle it like a newborn, careful not to tilt or breathe too hard. The crew clears space near the helm. Even the first mate, who once punched a priest in Lisbon for being too loud, stands silent. The captain unwraps it slowly, reverently. The crack gleams in the sunlight, almost a seam of gold. There's a hush, then a mutter from the navigator. That pattern, it's the same as the Maputo bloom, 1716. Everyone turns. Apparently, during a voyage to southern Africa, a cheese developed a similar crack just hours before the ship nearly struck an uncharted reef. The navigator knows this because he collects weird logs. He believes in cheese, patterns like monks believe in signs from above. And here it is again. Same fracture, same climate, same scent. You all brace. The ship slows. The helmsman adjusts course by 6 degrees port, just to be safe. 2 hours later, you pass a hidden outcrop of rock's teeth jutting from the sea like someone's trying to smile through pain. If you hadn't changed course, you'd have torn your hole open on them. The crew doesn't cheer. It's too weird for celebration. Instead, someone nods toward the cheese. "Good girl," he whispers. You store her away with more care than usual. You wrap her tighter, line the box with fresh cloth, even tuck in a clove or two to absorb the extra humidity. It feels ridiculous, but it also feels earned from that day forward. Every bell is now followed by a cheese check, not because it's precise, but because it responds. The bells just ring. Regardless, the cheese reacts. You're learning to appreciate that difference. Your ship once ran entirely on rhythm bells and sand. Now it runs on ... feel. Like jazz, but saltier. Each shift begins with a check-in. How's the wind? How's the hull? How's the cheese? Sometimes it's solid, sometimes it's damp. Once, it was jittery, according to the log. That day, lightning struck the mast. Coincidence? Maybe. But you've stopped dismissing things so easily. There's something poetic about it, how a wheel of dairy, once destined for someone's sandwich, became a living archive of your voyage. It absorbs the voyage in silence. The sweat, the air, the fear, the celebration. Each bloom and fissure is a sentence. Each softening, a mood. And unlike the bells, those proud, clangy braggarts of the upper deck, the cheese never demands attention. It simply ... waits. Gervin says it's like his old wife back in Hull. Stinks a bit. Never lies. Doesn't like being rushed. You keep that to yourself. Late that night, the fog rolls back in. The ship rocks gently. The bell rings once, but no one's sure if it's the right time. You drift down again to check her. The cheese is warm, content, blooms steady. No new fractures. You smile. You write one word in the log. Trust. Trust. The phantom island and the cheese that knew. You wake to commotion, not panic. Not shouting, but that specific kind of tension that only comes from seeing something that shouldn't be there. Voices are clipped, orders whispered, people moving in ways that say, pretend everything's fine, but sharpen your knives just in case. You climb topside, eyes still crusty, and there it is, looming out of the morning mist, like a half-remembered story. An island. Small, craggy, covered in dark green brush and weirdly symmetrical ridges. It's not on your charts. It's not on any chart. You know, because the captain's standing there flipping through all of them, one by one, with increasing exasperation. This isn't supposed to exist, he says, which is a great way to start your day. And yet, the island is real, solid, unwelcoming, like a sore tooth rising from the sea. The navigator swears they're still on course. We've only deviated 20 miles at most, he says. There's nothing out here. His voice shakes. He's not convincing anyone. You glance at the cheese log. Someone's written an entry just before dawn. Rind felt taut, soft under pressure. Faint blue blooming west edge. You blink. You remember what the whisperer said 2 nights ago. Blue on the west face means interference. It's the kind of phrase you usually ignore. But now, staring at this island that wasn't supposed to be there, you can't help but wonder, did the cheese already know? Historians still argue whether so-called phantom islands were ever real or simply cartographic mistakes. Some were invented by merchants, hoping to claim new trade routes. Others were misidentified mirages. But a few, a very few, were verified by multiple ships and then never seen again. Erased by time. Or maybe by someone who didn't want them found. You feel a shiver crawl up your neck. The captain decides to anchor offshore. No one wants to go ashore, but curiosity is an anchor of its own. The ship creaks to a slow drift as the crew fumbles with rowboats, quietly arguing over who has to go. You, naturally, are volunteered. Before you climb down into the boat, Gervin grabs your wrist and says, "Take her with you." You know who? He means the cheese, wrapped tight, placed in a box with soft cloth and a small slate for notes. You cradle it like a relic as the boat pushes off toward the mysterious island. The sea is still here and naturally so. No birds, no waves. Just that smooth, eerie silence, broken only by the creak of your oars. You land. The shore is rocky, sharp as broken pottery, and smells faintly of sulfur. Not fresh death, more like something that's been waiting. You walk, inland, cheese in hand, your boots crunching over black pebbles. The air gets warmer, but not from sunlight. There is no sunlight, just gray, like the sky gave up and decided to sulk. Then you hear it, a low hum, faint, pulsing. The whisperer freezes. You hear that? You do. It's not a sound exactly, more like a feeling, like standing near a storm that hasn't happened yet. You stop, near a small ridge. Sit. Unwrap the cheese. You don't know what you're expecting. Maybe a hiss, a glow, a spontaneous lecture on timekeeping. Instead, you just see a fresh crack, forming subtle, delicate. A tiny line, arcing westward like the sweep of a sundial's shadow. You record it, west-leaning arc, mild bloom pulse, rind warm. The whisperer nods. She's warning us. You stay a little longer. You don't find anything, no animals, no trees, no ruins. Just stone, mist, and an overwhelming sense that you've interrupted something. Like you weren't supposed to know this place was here. By the time you row back, the crew is quiet. They see your face, they see the cheese, and they don't ask questions. The captain records the position in his personal log, then scratches it out immediately after. Better not to remember. You nod. You're already forgetting the shape of the island, but the cheese. It remembers Gervin, places it back in its cradle. She'll sleep better now. The next day, it's gone. The island, not the cheese. The fog lifts, and the ocean is empty. The navigator checks and double-checks every coordinate. We should have seen it, but nothing. The log entry remains. Phantom Island confirmed. Cheese showed early signs. Entry sealed. You try to forget, but at night, when the ship is quiet, you swear you smell the island against sulfur and silence. You go down to check the cheese. It's calm now, steady, not warm, no new fissures. But there's a new patch of mold, just the faintest hint shaped like a crescent island on the west side. You don't log it. Some things are better left to the cheese mutiny, or close enough. You know things are bad when the cheese is at the center of an argument. Worse, the argument. It starts with a bell off, by a full minute, and everyone knows it. The sandglass had clumped again, and no one trusted the ringer this time, especially not after he nodded off mid-shift last week and tried to fake the time by loudly clearing his throat and praying nobody noticed. So when the captain called for the course check, he did the unthinkable. He skipped the cheese, just waved it off. Don't need it. We have the sun. To be fair, the sun was out. A rare blazing coin in the sky. The kind of day that makes sailors temporarily believe in horoscopes and good luck charms. Spirits were high, maybe a little too high, but Gervin stood still, didn't salute, didn't nod, just said, "You can ignore her, but she won't ignore you." The deck went quiet. Not someone dropped the rum barrel quiet. Not even Manivord quiet. This was spiritual quiet. That deep, tight-lipped silence only possible among people who've been at sea too long and who know when something sacred just got insulted. The captain rolled his eyes, but it was already too late. The cheese had been disrespected. That evening, the wind turned. Not drastically, just enough to mess with the sails. Then the rudder jammed, the compass needle wobbled, and, perhaps worst of all, the soup burned. Coincidence? Historians still argue whether the belief in cheese karma was widespread or a superstition limited to a few eccentric ships. But in your case, there's no debate. The next morning, the cheese had bloomed violently, not just along the rind across the surface, a full skin of gray-green fuzz, like it had aged 10 years overnight, and the smell, like betrayal soaked in vinegar. The log simply read, "Extreme bloom, disturbed, possibly offended." Now, you know mold doesn't have emotions. It doesn't sulk. It doesn't retaliate. But it also doesn't usually mutate that fast. The captain still refused to acknowledge the pattern. "Just cheese," he muttered, pushing past it like it wasn't quietly becoming the soul of the ship. But the crew noticed. The whisperer started sleeping closer to the hold. Gervin offered an apology out loud to the cheese. Even the cook, who once tried to eat the sacred wheel, placed a small sliver of dried apple in the box as an offering. And the next morning, the mold receded, just a bit. Just enough. You started seeing more of this, the crew, treating the cheese like a barometer. And a being? Not quite worship, but ... reverence. By midweek, the cheese had been moved to a new box, with padding and a small velvet lining someone scavenged from an old officer's coat. There was a ceremony. No instruments, no speeches, just quiet nods, and the whisperer saying, "She's home now." It would be laughable if it weren't working, because that same day, the course realigned, the winds returned, the sun held. Coincidence? Maybe. But after what happened the last time they ignored the cheese, no one wanted to test her boundaries again. You started paying closer attention to the way it changed. Little things. The texture of the wax, the way the edges curled or didn't, the bloom density, the scent shifts. One day it smelled faintly of cinnamon, no reason at all, and that afternoon, a passing merchant ship gifted you real coffee beans in exchange for a bottle of brine-soaked tobacco. You began logging everything. Faint, nutmeg, edges cool, no fissures. Log, steady vibes, rind glossy. Bloom left corner, wind shift predicted, and it kept lining up. Not perfectly, not with the clockwork tick of a real chronometer, but close enough. Better than bells, better than stars. And then came the vote. Not official, of course, not in writing. But one night, around a barrel of grog and regret, Gervin said, "I trust her more than the captain." Someone nodded, Someone else added, "At least she warns us." You didn't say anything. But when the navigator spilled grog on his star map and the cheese logbook was kept pristine and dry, ... Well, the loyalty had shifted. The cheese had become the authority now. When the captain gives a command, someone checks her first. The bell still rings, but it's confirmed by the cheese. The heading still changes, but only if the cheese is comfortable. You hear someone call her Lady Gouda once, and it sticks. The next day, a small paper flag appears beside her box. Long may she mold. The captain hasn't addressed it, but he doesn't touch the box anymore. Historians still argue whether these so-called cheese mutinies were real or exaggerated in sailors' tales. Some journals suggest they were metaphor crew replacing rational systems with intuition. Others believe ships did, for a time, operate under the guidance of non-traditional timekeepers, including everything from cheese to candles to prayer pebbles. But you know what you saw. A ship lost at sea, found again by trusting the soft, pungent wisdom of dairy. As you drift off that night, the ship creaking in calm rhythm, you dream of a courtroom made of crackers, where the cheese sits as judge, whispering truth in spores. You wake up smiling, and somewhere below, the cheese watches, patient, silent, forgiving for now, forgiving for now. The cheese predicts a death, maybe. It's not a loud death. There's no cry, no splash, no dramatic thunderclap to mark it. Just a body still, folded over a barrel, like he'd been sleeping. Only, he wasn't Dot. It's the bell ringer, the same one who always seemed a bit too casual with the sandglass, always humming slightly offbeat, always guessing just enough to stay employed. Gone, and no one knows how. There are no wounds, no blood, no signs of poison or struggle. He just stopped. You're standing there, staring, trying to make sense of it, when Gervin appears behind you, holding the cheese logbook open to the most recent entry. It reads, "Unusual chill. Sudden bloom. Retraction. Edge. Hollow. Rind cold to touch. A stillness." You hadn't noticed it last night, scribbled quickly before bed. You just thought the hold was a little colder than usual. Maybe the breeze finally found a way in. But now, it reads like an obituary. The cheese had known. Historians still argue whether so-called death omens aboard ships had any foundation in real observation. Some believe sailors attributed normal changes in their surroundings, shifts in air, temperature, even smelt, to supernatural causes simply because they needed explanations in a world filled with randomness and risk. But others argue that when you live with something long enough, man, cheese, or see, you sense things, maybe even before they happen. You don't know what to believe, but you know that the cheese was right. It was colder than it should have been. The bloom did pull back, and now the bell ringer is gone, and no one wants to ring the bell. The captain holds a short ceremony. The body is wrapped. There are words, kind, confused, a bit too rehearsed. Then the splash, the ship moves on, but the crew is shaken. The whisperer adds a new category to the log template: presence. It's not defined, just a blank space, a feeling, a chance to say, something changed, something's here, or something isn't. You check the cheese more often now, sometimes twice a day, and each time, you hesitate before unwrapping it, half afraid of what you'll find, half afraid you'll find nothing at all. But she's still there, still molding, still telling the truth. After the death, her scent shifts, more acidic, less fruity, almost astringent. You record it, low bloom, no cracks, presence, watchful. That night, the whisperer leaves a sliver of honey next to her. As thanks, you all begin talking softer, below deck, as if not to wake her. Something strange starts to happen then, a shift not in course, but in attention. The cheese becomes less of a curiosity and more of a barometer for morale. When she's stable, the crew breathes easier. When she sours, so do tempers. When she's bloomed thick and fluffy, the ship practically hums with optimism. Men scrub the deck without being asked. Sails are trimmed with cheerful precision. The cook even adds herbs to the stew. But if the mold retracts, if the rind gets wet or tight, no one jokes. Gervin once called it the mood of the wheel, and it's real. You see it, you feel it. It gets stranger when 3 days later, someone gets sick, a fever, shaking hands. He mumbles nonsense about shadows in the water, and just before the symptoms hit, you'd written, faint discoloration, slight bruising near base. Scent, medicinal. Presence, uneasy. No one dares say the cheese predicted it, but no one dares say it didn't. Either. You start seeing more patterns. A tiny fissure appears. A crate falls loose that afternoon. The bloom spikes green. A pod of dolphins surrounds the ship the next morning, always seen as a good omen. You keep writing. The logbook thickens. Every change, every shift, matched with what followed. It becomes your secret language. The cheese speaks. You translate. Still, it's not always perfect. One morning you record. Unstable bloom, wax warm, scent sharp, presence absent. Everyone braces for something terrible, but nothing happens. That night, you realize why. The clock had stopped, the chronometer ticking just a little too quietly. You open the case, and sure enough, the mechanism has jammed. A minuscule gear out of alignment. No one had noticed, except her. Presence absent. She wasn't warning of a death. She was marking the loss of time itself. Gervin nods solemnly. She's broader now, seeing more. The cheese isn't just a timekeeper anymore. She's a barometer of life, a recorder of mood, a mirror to the ship. Somehow, she's part of it, all now, like she's grown into the soul of the voyage. And maybe, just maybe, she's helping keep it afloat. You find yourself trusting her more than the maps, more than the clock, more than the captain even. Because she doesn't pretend to know, she just responds. And somehow, that's more honest than anything else. Where cheese became law, you'd think it would take a dramatic moment to change a ship's hierarchy, a mutiny, maybe, a sword fight in the galley, someone standing on a barrel shouting, "Down with the captain, up with the wheel of mold." But no, it happens with a vote, quiet, implicit, almost polite. It begins when the ship drifts into what the old maps call a confused sea. Waves from multiple directions, swells overlapping, wind arguing with itself. The kind of water that makes you feel like you're being politely jostled by several large, wet, invisible gentlemen who all want to stand in the same place. The captain, flustered and more than a little seasick, announces a new course. Due north. It looks clean on the charts. Fewer islands, fewer reefs, better trade winds, in theory. But the cheese disagrees. You know this, because you just logged it that morning. Bloom, split, rind brittle, deep musty scent, presence wary, northward edge retreating. You take it to Gervin. He reads it 3 times, frowns, licks his finger, sniffs the cheese, stares out the porthole, then says flatly, "She doesn't like north." The captain does not take this well. "Since when does a snack dictate navigation?" he says, slamming the door to his cabin hard enough to wake the cheese in her cradle. She wobbles slightly. The bloom shivers. The crew doesn't argue. They just ... don't turn north ... without planning, without a formal rebellion. The helmsman quietly adjusts 2 degrees east. The sails follow. The navigator shrugs, and the ship obeys the mold. The next day, smooth sailing. Even the confused sea stops being so confusing. The logbook notes it without flourish. Adjusted course. Bloom settled. Cheese at peace. You expect the captain to be furious. He's not. He's silent. He retreats to his quarters and emerges, only at meals, muttering to the chronometer, like it's a dog that bit him by now. Even the chronometer has lost some of its shine. After that, things shift. Formally, the captain still gives the orders. Informally, the cheese confirms them. If the bloom suggests danger, the crew delays. If the rind grows supple and warm, plans proceed. One time, a storm looms far on the horizon, black clouds clawing at the sky, like angry ink. The cheese shows no change, no tension, no cracks. The crew sails on. The storm passes behind them, never touching the hull. You call her the quiet judge in your private notes. Someone else carves a tiny seat into the corner of her box, the tribunal chair. Gervin stops saying she's changing. He starts saying she decides. Historians still argue whether maritime crews ever gave legal or spiritual authority to objects aboard ship. There are scattered accounts: a lucky cannonball used to settle disputes, a broken spyglass that dictated rest days, even a talking parrot once considered part of the command chain. But at cheese, that's new, and yet no one's laughing. Because under her guidance, your voyage has become luckier, or perhaps less cursed. You've avoided reefs, found ports, caught favorable winds more often than not. You've even started naming things after her. The crew calls a narrow strait Gaudas Passage, a surprisingly fertile fishing zone. Water, a small island with unusual moss. The bloom. You are living in her geography now. Then, one afternoon, a trade ship appears, on the horizon, limping sails torn, hulls scorched from a lightning strike. They anchor nearby, grateful for aid. You exchange supplies, offer repairs. Their captain is gaunt and suspicious, but his crew is half-starved and desperate. He sees your cheese box, says, "You using that to sail?" You nod. He scoffs. "Should have thrown mine overboard. Thing turned sour on me halfway through the Red Sea." You pause. You had one. Sure. Tried the whole living compass gimmick. Didn't take. Mold got aggressive. Crew got weird. We ended up off course and cursed. Switched back to astrolabes. Smarter. You glance at your cheese. She's calm. No sharp scent. No bloom swelling. Just a quiet, even presence. Gervin whispers, "Ours likes us." And you realize maybe that's it. Maybe the cheese responds not to conditions, but to how it's treated. Yours has been wrapped gently, spoken to, trusted dots, probably tossed around like spoiled cargo. You return to your own deck that night with a strange sense of loyalty, like you're protecting her, and she's protecting you. The next morning, the trade ship leaves. The cheese sweats for the first time in weeks. Scent, iron presence, guarded, and then, later that afternoon, a mast floats by charred, snapped, marked with that ship's name. You never see them again. The crew doesn't speak of it. They just tighten the box's lid, offer a dried apricot, make another mark in the log. Judged, warned, survived. And now, you don't even pretend anymore. She's not a mascot. She's the law. She's the law. What the cheese remembers, that we forget. It's almost time to go home. The wind has shifted again, this time not in warning, but in invitation. The stars align just enough to trace familiar patterns in the sky. The sea no longer tries to surprise you. It just carries you gently, like a tired friend walking beside you in silence. The voyage is ending. You feel it in your bones, in your boots, in the long sighs of the sails. Everything on board slows gently, respectfully, like the final few notes of a lullaby. And the cheese, she's glowing, not literally, but close. The bloom is calm, uniform. The rind is thick and stable. There's no scent of distress, no twitch in the wax, no cracks trying to say, "Look out." She's resting, watching, waiting. You open the logbook for what may be the last routine entry and hesitate. What do you even write? Status, content, presence, patient, smells like, peace. You look back at page 1 weeks ago. Now, the entries are so clumsy at the beginning, so clinical. wax dry, bloom faint, rind temperature 23 degrees Celsius. You were trying to document her like an object, something external, a tool. Now the words are softer. You've started writing in metaphors. One entry simply says, "She exhaled today." The cheese has become a companion, a mirror, a journal written back at you. Historians still argue whether objects aboard ships develop meaning over time, or whether they simply reflect what humans need them to be. Some say it's all in your head. Others argue that long exposure to the sea alters how we interpret symbols, makes them sacred, or at least deeply personal. But this cheese, she knows. You bring her above deck on the final evening, something no one has done since the second month. It's calm. The water is as smooth as glass, the stars stitched overhead like buttons on velvet. You set her down gently on the wooden railing and sit beside her. You don't say anything, you just listen. And in that quiet, you remember. Not just this voyage, not just the storms and the sails and the odd island that may or may not have been real. You remember before. You remember the old harbor, the way the dock creaked beneath your boots that first day, the way you'd rolled your eyes at Gervin's talk of mold and time, the way you thought this would just be a job, a contract. You remember the first crack in the rind, the first smell of pine on a sea day, the first time she predicted a shift in the wind better than any chart. You remember the way the crew changed slowly, gently, like dough rising in a warm kitchen. How the cheese gave them something to believe in when the stars weren't visible. How even the captain, bitter to the end, eventually checked her box when no one was looking. And you remember the death. You remember the silence. You remember how she held it for you, quietly, so you wouldn't have to. The ship approaches port. By morning, land appears on the horizon like a dream you'd almost forgotten. Everyone is moving with purpose, now packing gear, polishing boots, writing down lies to tell their loved ones about how uneventful the voyage was. But below deck, one last time, you sit with her. You clean the wax, wrap her in the same soft cloth she started with, close the lid. There's a vote. What to do with her now? Gervin says she should be sealed in a glass case, honored. The Whisperer suggests returning her to the sea, so she can sleep in the currents forever. But you carry her down the gangplank, yourself? She deserves to see land again. People stare, of course. Who walks off a ship, cradling cheese like it's a crown jewel? You don't care. You know what she is, what she did. She kept time. She warned of storms. She judged the wicked. She comforted the grieving. And she remembered what you forgot: how to listen, how to feel, how to trust something without needing to explain why. Later they'll ask you about the voyage, the charts, the trade routes, the storms. You'll nod, but what you'll really remember is mold blooming like a sunrise, the way wax shifted like waves, the scent of lemons just before landfall, and that feeling deep in your chest when you realized the cheese wasn't just tracking time. She was time. She held it softly, patiently. Peraview, word count, 1,101. Wind down final 300 words. And now, as the voyage ends, and the sea grows quiet behind you, let your mind drift gently. Picture the ship again, wood creaking, sails whispering, and somewhere below deck, a small, silent wheel resting in her box. Calm, watchful, at peace. You imagine her still there, nestled in cloth, no longer working, no longer warning, just ... being. She isn't a clock. She never was. She doesn't tick or talk or ring. She breathes. Her mold rises and falls like ocean swells, slow and steady, like a sleeper in a warm bed. She asks nothing. She demands nothing. She just records the world with bloom and scent and silence. And now, you breathe like her, in ... and out. The room around you softens. The fan hums, like the waves once did. Your body sinks into the bed, like the ship into the harbor, held and still. Maybe you dream of waves, of warm wood and starlight, of tiny cracks in a rind that told you everything you needed to know. Or maybe you don't dream at all. Maybe you just sleep, like the sea does. Sometimes deep, still endless. Now rest, sailor. The mold will keep watch.